More people may be joining after the coffee break, but why don't we get started? I hope you can hear us okay. Welcome to our session entitled Increasing Monitoring and Filing Obligations, hosted by ICLA, the In-House Competition Lawyers Association. My name is Yves Daams. I'm the chair of the organization. For those who don't know ICLA, we're an informal group of, in the meantime, already over 500 in-house counsels, in-house competition counsels, largely based in Europe, but broadly, people from all over the world have joined our organization. We hold meetings on a regular basis. Of course, we participate in policy consultations, often on topics of sort of legal certainty, procedural aspects, because our members join in their personal capacity. It is not a trade organization, so we try to look at items that are common to our members. I have here with me today the pleasure of four additional ICLA members. We have Granja Holsworth with us today, who's also vice chair of the Alliance. She's head of EU competition policy at Deutsche Telekom. Angelique de Broes, who's head of competition law and policy at Johnson & Johnson. We have Giuseppe Izzo, managing associate general counsel at Cargill, and Philippe Kroene, head of antitrust support for green traditional refining and marketing, support functions, and international networking at Eni, and also the chair of ICLA Italy. I already provided a brief overview of what ICLA is. Again, we'll focus today on the variety of increasing filing obligations that we see today, both from an FDI, a merger perspective, also from a foreign direct subsidies perspective, which is a new regulation you may very well be aware of that was recently introduced. Granja, I think you wanted to do a brief introduction and an overview. What are your thoughts on these increasing filing obligations?
Thank you very much, and I'll try without the mic if that works for all of you, if you hear me well. If not, put a hand sign and then I'll switch to the mic. Indeed, I wanted to give a bit of an overview of the burden. Oh, you're recording. Okay, perfect. Okay, I wanted to give a bit of an overview of the burden from a bigger picture as in-house counsel when you're facing a merger transaction, because in the old days that I remember, it was a simple merger filing nationally or with the European Commission or the US. Now we have multi-layers, not only on the merger control, but also on the foreign subsidy, foreign direct investment, etc. So if you look at the different layers, it starts with the proliferation of national and international merger filing systems. You have more and more sophisticated merger systems with more or less nexus that require filing. So we're faced with multi-jurisdictional filings on the one hand. Then you have the layer of Article 22, which basically introduces a filing which is not very predictable whether you need to notify or not at the end of the day. And now we are blessed with the safety net of Article 102 with the Towercast decision, which has been picked up by the Belgium authority already in the Proximus case. So you have kind of already on the merger control 3 layers apart from the regional kind of multi-jurisdictional filings. Then on top of that, we have increasing national FDI filings, which are very burdensome for us because they're not very transparent. And therefore difficult to manage. Then we have the FSR filing, which comes with very difficult reporting obligations, and we will hear about that more afterwards. And then we now are facing the Media Freedom Act notification and maybe an outbound investment notification in future. So you can imagine with all these layers of diversity, trying to manage that from an in-house perspective is very difficult. I mean, if the management asks me what is the timeline, I'm not sure what I should advise, because between all these different filing systems, it's very difficult to get a consistent timeline. Then if you look at contractual provisions, you have obviously linked to the timeline, what is the right long stop date, how many provisions for prolonging the long stop date you need, what is the right risk allocation with regard to the different filings that are necessary, because the responsibilities also are different. And then you need to coordinate all the authorities. I mean, you need to see who do I address when do I go to them, how do I make sure that they have a harmonized approach with regard to information that they need, with regard to timelines again, and last but not least, how do I make sure that the remedies, I mean, consistent, I think, is wishful thinking, but at least not are contradictory, and also do not destroy the whole value of the transaction. So there is a lot of complexity that I'm not sure we have all the answers from an in-house perspective on how to deal with it, but I think that's just to give you the bigger picture. And my advice so far, which is very superficial, is first of all, decide who you want to go to and who not, because there are obviously jurisdictions which don't have a local nexus where you might say, for this transaction, it doesn't make any sense to go there, it's already complex enough. And then decide when to approach which authority, but probably at an early stage in order to make sure you could get some kind of harmonization. And then get the authorities, which is the most difficult, to focus on key areas rather than doing a broad sweep and making sure they don't miss anything. And I leave it there. To be complex enough.
And clearly more than enough to fill 45 minutes of this panel. We'll deep dive into a couple of the specific items that Grania raised during the course of this panel. We'll start off with the Foreign Subsidies Regulation, talk a little bit about FDI as well, and then about the merger sort of below threshold point. Maybe just to start off with the Foreign Subsidies Regulation. So I think you will probably all well be aware that as of the 12th of October, there are notification obligations that come into force based on the introduction of, as I said earlier, the new Foreign Subsidies Regulation. The filing thresholds, interestingly, aren't based on the receipt of subsidies, but the Commission is using these terms of foreign financial contributions, which is a term very broadly defined, and even includes sales as a company that you make, or basically payments that a public authority would make to your company as compensation for the goods and services they may receive. So if as a company you're engaged very actively in public sales or sales towards public authorities, that in and of itself may already trigger some of the thresholds. Now, just by way of brief introduction, I think a couple of points. As you know, again, the notifications will be relevant from a M&A, or largely from an M&A and public procurement thresholds. There's sort of an ex officio investigation power as well, but I'll focus on the first two. Just from a high-level perspective, because the thresholds aren't always very easy and straightforward. But I think what is interesting to see from an M&A context is that you need to look at your entire group structure when you're looking at defining so-called foreign financial contributions. In a notification form, and maybe just before going to notification form, the thresholds admittedly are relatively high, but the burdens that are imposed on having to comply with the notifications are pretty significant. For example, in terms of thresholds from a public procurement perspective, we're looking at public procurements as of 250 million. For an M&A perspective, we're looking at transactions where, for example, a target would have an EU turnover of 500 million. So it's transaction of a certain size. That being said, I think what we see with a lot of members, and actually what I see personally in my in-house role as well, even if you'd only have one notification a year, you need to be prepared. So then going back very briefly onto the notifications, as I said, for an M&A context, you need to look at the entire group. You need to provide details for foreign financial contributions that are most likely to distort internal market, and those are defined, in the regulation. But at least when you stay out of that, thresholds or details are only needed when foreign financial contributions reach the threshold of 45 million per country. So that is, again, a reasonable threshold, but you do have to define and you do have to assess whether you actually reach that threshold or not, so still need to collect, a lot of that data. From a public procurement perspective, that 45 million threshold is much lower. The Commission implementing regulation is there talking about 1 million per country, but the positive thing one could say is that is it one? Oh, is it 4 million? Oh, it's 4 million. And but the positive thing there, I think, is that you can look when identifying foreign financial contributions at the legal entity that is submitting the bid, its subsidiaries and direct parent companies. So you do not need to look at the entire group structure of the undertaking. Important, I think, for both data questions, even though this doesn't count for the calculation of the thresholds, when you need to prepare the notifications, tax benefits, for example, of general nature, and the sales of goods and services that I was talking about earlier, when they occur on market terms, they don't need to be included in those notifications either. Now, 2 quick points from a higher level perspective to conclude. In public procurement, from a public procurement perspective, there isn't just the notification thresholds. For 250 million deals, even if you haven't received notifiable foreign financial contributions, you still need to make a declaration. So apart from the notification system, there's also a declaration system. And then again, strangely enough, there's quite a laborious sort of data exercise attached to that as well. And the final point, you don't only need to look at your own company when making notifications, you also need to take into account main suppliers. And main suppliers are those companies that would contribute for 20% of the value of the deal. So if you look at a 250 million deal, if one of your suppliers is supplying products to you for 50 million of that deal, then you need to include that supplier's details in your notification as well. Now, just briefly from ICLA's perspective, we've been very active in discussing with the Commission the initial thresholds, the regulation, and I think we are very happy to say that the implementing regulation at least is offering a slightly more manageable system, but there's still, I think, a lot of work to be done and a lot leading up to the 12th of October and afterwards, as companies and our members are trying to understand how to handle this. And I think, Angelique, you've been certainly one of those members, one of the many members that have been looking at this in detail. How do you prepare internally for this? What's the impact? Happy to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much. And I think with Giuseppe, we decided to split this part on the more practical aspect between me setting out the issues that companies are facing with all these new requirements, especially FSR, but not only. And Giuseppe is going to deal with, how companies can prepare and put in place systems to deal with these new complexities. So I'd like to treat maybe as part of the overall issues that we face. There are maybe three buckets, I would say. So the first one is really, the increased complexity, as Grania was explaining, the increased uncertainty, and then maybe, the more practical challenges that we see internally. So on the complexity, I don't think I need to come back into details to what's been said, but obviously, now we see indeed for a given deal, not only the classic merger filings when you need to check jurisdiction all over the world, you have now indeed below thresholds as well, so you need to look into the substance of your deal, not only the thresholds. And then on top of it, we see more and more FDI filing systems. So depending on your industry, you may also need to do FDI filing. I work in the healthcare sector. Since COVID, obviously, healthcare has become a bit of a an area of public interest, let's say, for a lot of countries. So suddenly we are being caught also by FDI, potentially, with a lot of uncertainty, because in a lot of the regimes, it's not entirely clear whether you're in or not, depending on the categories of product. But, you know, I guess this is quite specific to healthcare. But, and then the little last one, the FSR, which creates, you know, enormous issues for companies that are, you know, big enough to be triggered. So I don't know when the next deal is going to happen where we buy a target of 500 million. But as you know, Yves was saying, we can't wait to see that deal coming, to start preparing. We need to be prepared because the timeline is very short, because you can't delay your deal for, you know, forever to get the information. So that's the first complexity. The second one is when you work for a multinational company and you're dealing with, you know, different businesses, like hundreds, if not thousands, of different legal entities active in over 150 different countries, plus the EU27 that don't count in that case. You know, looking for the information in and of itself is something that, you know, I've had problems finding sleep at night, just trying to visualize how possibly we can make sure that we manage to get access to this information. So it's a huge burden on companies. It's obviously a huge burden on the legal department. Not all companies will be very well equipped to organize this kind of data gathering system. It involves a very heavy cost if you want to create a robust system that makes you, you know, that allows you to collect all this information. Obviously, you need to go back 3 years as well. And it's on a rolling basis, so you can't do it once a year on the basis of a financial year. You need to, you know, when you prepare your notification, you need to be able to report those notifiable subsidies or financial contributions basically up to the day before the notification, let's say. So that is extremely burdensome. It has a heavy impact on the timeline as well. Gania was alluding to it. And it has an impact also on the deal documentation. And that is the classic, you know, what does it mean in terms of condition precedent? What does it mean in terms of long stop dates and closing dates? Do you need to plan some potential extensions, that kind of things? And also allocation of responsibility if something goes wrong between the buyer and the seller. Now moving on to uncertainties. Not only you need to deal with, you know, the classic competition law assessment of your transaction, but you also need to check whether politically you may face any national concern under the FDI, because the criteria there are totally different from the merger control criteria. It's really, you know, employment, whether some capabilities are going to be controlled by foreign parents, for example, that kind of more political aspects. It creates also, there are also issues in relation to transparency, because you don't have such an easy access to the ministries when you do an FDI filing as you would in most cases, at least with European competition authorities. And then you have the third layer, obviously, FSR, which looks into whether you received subsidies that may distort competition, which is yet again another type of legal assessment that you need to bring into your transaction. So whether you need 3 law firms to help you assess all this, I don't know, but, you know, from an in-house perspective, this can be really challenging, especially if you don't have, you know, specialists, in-house people. So I think I will not go into a lot more details, but, you know, in terms of challenges, obviously we're talking, especially with the FSR, huge amount of information. If, you know, summarized a bit what we're talking about, so it's not only subsidies, but it's also foreign financial contributions. Needless to say that in the healthcare sector, we are selling essentially to public hospitals. So you can imagine that basically all a huge proportion of our sales basically would fall under this definition. So query, do you have to look into these in details or not? Luckily, the implementing regulation gave a bit of leeway in that respect. But lots of questions are still pending in terms of what you need to report, what you need to collect. And just to give you an example, we had a meeting with the European Commission, something which sounds totally stupid, but a real life question is that any contracts, let's say, or supply agreement with a public body, so in our case, a public hospital, doesn't need to be reported if it's at arm's length. So commercial contracts, any contract which is entered following, a transparent public procurement procedure, all this you don't have to report. Fair enough. But then I raised the question, we have, and we're not the only ones as a pharma company, we have those programs where we will actually help government in less advantaged countries, like in Africa typically, get access to some of our medicines. And in that case, we are putting into place some schemes where we're prepared to grant them some discounts or some free goods or things like this to favor access to medicine so that they can treat their patients or their population. So these are not at arm's length. So in that case, we are giving discounts. We are not getting any money. We are giving discounts. But since we are getting some money, this falls within the definition of foreign financial contributions. These are not at arm's length. So in theory, we would need to find this information and report it, which sounds like slightly counterintuitive when you know that what the purpose of the regulation is to look at subsidies that we would receive. And then the Commission tells you, sure, but obviously, let's discuss when you come and see us. We may envisage a waiver, but at the end of the day, internally, you would, in theory at least, still have to collect this information. So it's one concrete example of the kind of daily nightmare questions that we look at. Now to how companies can accommodate. Pass on the.
Thank you. Now I'm tasked with the easiest part of this panel, providing the solution, and I'm going to tackle this under an M&A perspective. I've been in this role looking after regulatory approval in M&A transaction globally for almost the last 10 years, so relatively new, but the deal team have continued to ask about deal certainty and advice on speed of closing. So now coming here, I was asking myself, can we still provide this certainty or advice on these two important aspects of transaction? I answered myself, yes, we probably can, but we will need to prepare well in advance. We will need to consider new and non-traditional factors, as Angelique and Grania pointed out, political elements. It will come at higher cost, and I think deal team will continue to deal with a higher level of uncertainty, which is not necessarily what they are expecting. So now coming to the solution in all this uncertainty, or how company can prepare, or maybe better, what lesson have I learned while preparing? Because we are preparing since a while, and I would divide this in three big buckets: is people, process, and strategy. So if I look at people, what does it mean? We need to continue as legal functions to change the mindset of deal teams, because they are more used to the traditional factors, antitrust factors, the usual theory of harm, but today is no longer only about that. There is, of course, FDI criteria that are no longer fully transparent. There are things that they were not used to. So this is what we need to lead. The second factor is that we need to invest on people. We have formed a team internally that now looks after merger control, FDI, and more recently FSR, to have the holistic view and the holistic perspective around all the regulatory aspect of transaction. But this means that we need more resources, different capabilities, and of course we need to cooperate even more with other functions. You think of FSR, tax, finance, IT, and then I moved into process. For FSR, we had to map our gaps and see what we had, what we don't have, what capabilities our system have or our people have in terms of reporting certain information. I learned through this more than I was expecting in my legal profession about ERP system and the limitation of being on different system and how difficult it is to generate reports of data that we may need. But also about processes when we deal with a transaction outside of the EU, where, for example, a target in Brazil is going to become an affiliate, and we will need to report this data into if we have a EU deal. So this goes back to strategy. So what is the core of our strategy, I think, is still the risk analysis, but is a broader risk analysis that we need to do. We need to consider, of course, the FSR, the FDI, merger control, political factor, non-traditional theory of harm, and particularly now that if you look at FSR guidance, will probably arrive in a year or more when there is sufficient practice. And if you look at merger control guidelines, if you look at what is happening in the US, where merger guidelines has been are under discussions, but you see the expansion of issue lists or even criteria that we were not used to, bringing down to the market threshold of 30% if the authority wants to think of a transaction as problematic. And so I think one other element of our preparation, what we are learning, is that we need to think about dialogue. To Grania's point, we need to think about where we want to involve or have the dialogue with the authorities, and this is a critical part of our preparation. At the same time, we realize that also authorities are under pressure because there is uncertainty of the rules, there is a lack of resources, there are many other lack of case of precedents. So we will need to deal with this uncertainty. So not sure this is a solution or a mathematical formula to get to conclude here is that, of course, we will need to prepare and really consider other factors that we were not used to, including the political element and the political uncertainty. We will need to have different systems or invest in systems or build systems to create reportability of this data. It will come at higher cost, but the investment is not going to bring us back the deal certainty that our internal team continue to demand. So it's really, to close on a positive note, I think I would say we need to continue to have dialogue with the authority. We need to continue to participate in the formation of guidance, because my hope is that by participating we can explain the complexity we are tasked internally to make this work. And sometimes this is far beyond what is potentially possible for a company. So I hope through this dialogue we can get to a more right-sized solution.
Thank you, Giuseppe. And I think that's a dialogue that ICLA, I think, has been trying to offer sort of from an in-house perspective, direct conversations with the Commission around sort of what are the practical implications of some of this. Philippe, you wanted to talk a little bit about sort of below filing or below threshold filings and sort of burdens, the recent developments around that sort of burdens linked to that. Happy to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you, Yves, and let me join you in thanking also Lear for organizing this conference and having us again here. Well, as all of us usually do in our discussions, I will, of course, speak in my personal capacity. And I will bring you back to an old argument that is simply merger control, but with a new nightmare. We all know about merger below thresholds being a new area that we have to deal with, and so a new area of concern. It's a new issue that brings us and forces us to analyze the substance of the deals before even going looking to turnover figures and so on. So somehow much more stimulating, but of course posing different management issues for us. And so I just want to give you some brief flashes on the EU perspective, so Article 22, the Italian perspective, so Article 16, paragraph 1 bis of the Italian competition law, and if we have enough time, a flash on one or two cases. So what's new under Article 22? We have seen that, and I assume we all know what we are talking about, so the system of referral to the Commission and the power for the Commission to ask for a notification even of a transaction, even if it's not only below EU thresholds, but even below national thresholds. This has been applied in the Illumina case, Illumina Grail case. We thought that it would have been the first case of a long series, and then for a couple of years nothing else moved. And now, during the summer, we have seen two other cases. And the European Commission is reported to have analyzed dozens of cases, even though only few got a referral in the end. What's interesting in these new cases is that they have concerned other sectors, other business sectors. So we're not anymore talking about big pharma and big tech. Now we know that the semiconductor sector, the chipset sector, so I consider this being more hardware, so not necessarily what we figured out being big tech, so not only platforms and other companies like maybe Google, Amazon, and so on. The other deal concerned power trading, something probably we considered being out of scope, at least relying on preliminary indication from the European Commission. By the way, the European Commission never said that there is any sector being excluded from the application of Article 22. But now we are sure it's for all sectors. And what's good maybe in these new recent cases is that apparently, as they were presented by the European Commission, they pose a serious concern, because one is a merger to monopoly and the other one is a case that at least as presented would concern the two main suppliers of this kind of chipset in the European market. So at least we know that when dealing with the substance of the deal at the EU level, we should only focus, or apparently the European Commission so far only focused on deals which really have a serious anti-competitive possible concern. Another development that I found quite interesting at the EU level was the fine against Illumina Grail for gun jumping in the Article 22 case. And what I found interesting was not the 432 million against Illumina, but rather the symbolic fine against Grail. Okay, it's only 1,000 euro, but we never thought that we would have risked a fine for gun jumping in a case where we are just selling something, so that the target can be also fine for gun jumping. So these are scary developments somehow, but to find the good news compared to what we will see at the Italian level is that apparently there must be a serious concern with respect to the impact of the transaction in the market. So moving to the Italian level, what we have seen, and I think we all know that the law was modified last year to allow also the Italian Competition Authority to ask for notification of transactions that are below Italian thresholds. And this could happen in cases where there might be somehow other kind of thresholds being satisfied, but these are quite easy to be met at least by large companies. So there must be at least one turnover threshold being satisfied, or the overall turnover, worldwide turnover, an aggregated turnover of all companies involved should be higher than 5 billion. So when talking about big companies, this is really easy to meet as a threshold. And then there should be concrete risk for competition in the Italian market or in a part thereof. And no more than 6 months should have elapsed since closing of the transaction. Concrete risk from competition, a quite broad definition for thresholds. And as we will see, this is apparently not being interpreted as the European Commission did in the cases that it opened. So this is a big area of concern. At least we have a deadline, so meaning that the Italian Competition Authority cannot wait sine die to open, or not to open a proceeding, but to ask for a merger filing. So this seems to be a good news. But we know that the Italian Competition Authority, even though it apparently had not yet publicly requested for a merger filing, but it declared that it is seeking for cases to apply this new provision. So already before the summer, we had public officials declaring that they were looking and sending RFIs to companies in several sectors. They also confirmed no sector is excluded by this legislative novel. And what happened afterwards, the Italian Competition Authority published guidelines on the application of this new provision. As ICLA, we also contributed to the public consultation, and few changes happened afterwards. So main critical aspects are still there. One, as I said before, is the broad notion of risks for competition, because just to give you an example, in the guidelines, what the authority is saying is just that it is unlikely that it will ask for a notification of a horizontal merger if the combined market share is below 25%. It is unlikely. They even not do exclude this. So this is just an element to give you an idea of how broad, how far they can go. Another problem that may happen is that even target companies may be required to file. So this again is something that we wouldn't, as a target company, would never be prepared to do that. So we need to take care of this aspect also when we are a seller. And we risk heavy fines. So not like in the Grail case, not a symbolic fine, because it is specified that fines can go up to 1% of the turnover. And this is something that we criticized, of course, in the public consultation, but the only thing we obtained somehow was that this request shall be motivated. So the competition authority can ask for the merger filing to be made by the target company, but it shall motivate its request. So not really much change, let's say. Another critical issue is the deadline. So if you happen to be requested to make a merger filing, you shall do that in a 30 days deadline, which is very strict, is something that is already in the law, so the competition authority could not change it anyway. It's another aspect that was criticized, and at least we obtained that we will be allowed to ask for an extension of this deadline, but it will anyway not go longer than further 30 days, and again with a motivated request, which is quite strange because you are assigned a deadline that is much stricter than what you are usually using to prepare merger filings, even in transactions that pose no critical issues, but where you are well in advance prepared to file because you know that thresholds are met and so on. So this will again be a challenge. And so let's see which are the remedies that maybe we can try to use to manage these risks. Because again, not only we have a strict deadline, but an incomplete filing can be fined again up to 1% of your turnover. So here also we requested to cancel at least this fining opportunity for the ICA, but our request was not retained, let's say. So what are the remedies? The remedy that the Italian Competition Authority is suggesting is come to us. let's talk before so that you are prepared. And this is put in the guidelines. And so what they offer is a voluntary filing. So you can go and present your transaction with a very small and easy filing and wait for their reply. What is the problem here? The problem is that you need to state why your transaction could cause concrete risk for competition, which is exactly the opposite that you would do in any kind of transaction where there might be even a possible effect on competition. So is it a viable remedy? I don't know. I would not suggest going that path, at least nowadays. And what's the other problem with voluntary filing is that the authority will give you an answer in 60 days. This is a good news because in the original version of the guidelines there was no date, so you go there, you ask and you wait. So what we obtain is at least a deadline for the competition authority to give a feedback. But this again will happen only, I mean the 60 days deadline will start counting only once you provided them with a complete set of information. So it's difficult to say when they will consider this to have been fulfilled. This is, of course, strongly encouraged by the competition authority, but we will need to see whether it is a viable solution. So what else? What else we can do? It's something we would anyway need to do, probably. So working on contractual clauses. And the only thing that came to my mind is having another interim period. So you have the signing, you have an interim period, you have the closing, and you have another interim period, because the deadline for the competition authority to ask you for filing starts from closing. So you need to close. But then what I would recommend is let's wait with a further interim period, six months, before doing serious things, in order to be prepared for a possible filing and a possible decision which is not authorizing the deal. So you should be prepared to somehow descramble the egg, and so not go too far in the 6 months period that the Italian Competition Authority is allowed. And of course, working on the hell or high water clauses, so to have an agreement between the parties of how would we deal, what will we do if we don't get, in the end, the approval. The only thing, just to leave you with a good news, the only thing I found interesting when discussing the applicability of this in a particular case internally, so saying to business people, look, apparently we are below thresholds. So this is a good news. We are not forced to make a filing. But there is this novelty. Since it's not an obvious transaction, there is this risk. I thought that they would have reacted in a strange way, but they found it reasonable. It is a much more comprehensible system for the business compared to the threshold system, where you have a deal in Malaysia and you say to your people, well, you need to make a merger filing in Ukraine. So maybe, even though less uncertain, this is something that we should keep in mind. It's somehow more acceptable. It poses new management risks that you have to deal with. Maybe one day we will be all used to this and it will not sound so strange. But apparently it's something that the business community would be more easy, more ready to accept, at least with the deadline. Different thing is Article 22, where you're left pending for years. So that's all I would say on merger below thresholds. We could touch also the argument of Article 102. I don't know whether this...
I think we're a little bit tight.
Yeah, so I'm stopping here.
Okay, super. Now, there was an interesting point, Philippe, that you touched upon when the authority said, well, come and see us. I've noted, I think, recently, you know, from an in-house perspective, you need to do your internal sort of risk assessment. So either if you have unclear rules, you either get additional guidance from the authority, or you can go to the authority and say, hey, we have this in transaction, do you believe it is notifiable or not? But more and more, actually, I see the response coming back from the authority to say, oh, we can't tell, you just make your own decision, and the risk. So I find that a little bit of a worrying development as well. Grania, any concluding remarks you wanted to add?
Well, I like that you managed to convince your business side that it's positive. I think that's something I'm still struggling with. I mean, we all, and our business side in particular, likes legal certainty, but what I see in the whole complexity that we're losing legal certainty, Article 22, 102, FDI for us is a very, very intransparent process from nationality to nationality. FSR is super burdensome. We don't know where they're going, and it's nice to say that they also are restrained from the capacity-wise, but at the time, if we fail to do it, we get fined. If they fail to enforce it, they don't see any fine or anything. So I think there's still a kind of asymmetric burden on our side. And my mantra actually normally is kind of reducing complexity. I like the rule 1 in, 1 out. I like what von der Leyen said in her State of the Union to reduce reporting requirements by 25%. And as in-house lawyer, that is really what I'm currently fighting for, because what we are facing at the moment is just not surmountable.
Thank you.
I think one last comment is in relation to the US process, which we, from a European perspective, thought was so nice and easy and quick, and you just fill in a form. You just wait for the suspension period, and then you can just go ahead. And now in the US, we will also have an additional layer, because they're moving towards a very heavy filing system, which looks more and more like what we have at EU level. So, a lot of additional documents, a lot of additional information to provide in filings, which is not great for competition lawyers, but for EU competition lawyers means that the US starts to vaguely understand a little bit, why you're being so annoying on those deals when they're used to the US system and not so much the EU system. So, there seems to be a bit of alignment. So probably not in the right direction, but.
And just to add a quick note of publicity for ICLA there, we actually will be submitting today our comments. I think a 20-page document with thoughts from ICLA's perspective on the consultation there. So we'll make that public, and happy to hear your thoughts on that as well. I think we're at the 45-minute sort of bar that we were set for our panel. I don't know if we have time for questions, or if we can take if there are any questions.
With regards to merger control, that's a known concept. So I'm just wondering, how do you deal with it in practice? Do you sort of go from case to case and say, oh, I have this notification from this old transaction, let's see what I can reuse from that? Or do you go sort of more fundamentally preparing, having a complete description of your whole business ready to push the button?
I mean, I think from my perspective, every transaction eventually is very different. So the merger notifications, the assessment around it, the deal rationale, the market shares you need to provide. Of course, you can potentially copy-paste the company description from your annual report, but other than that, I do think it's quite a sort of a detailed and specific for each transaction.
Yeah, and I also think being in the telecoms industry where you see certain developments, maybe not every year as you see in digital markets, we actually would like to see those developments being recognized, and we often find that the Commission kind of has their textbook that they pull out the same kind of concept that they had 20 years for a telecoms merger and don't adapt. And there actually we try to see what is the situation, what is the market environment, what have been the recent developments, what is driving the transaction. So indeed, every transaction is different, and we would welcome the authorities also to look with a fresh pair of eyes at the end of the day.
Thank you. Any other final questions? Maybe just one more.
Thank you. In terms of FDI, have you seen in practice that business teams are considering restructuring to avoid certain FDI filings? For example, if a threshold is if you acquire 10%, very simple, then you have to file. So maybe the business could consider acquiring 9%.
Yeah, maybe I can kick this off, but I've not seen really the structuring transaction also because it could not pay off eventually because the criteria that trigger reportability are not necessarily the criteria that trigger the final decision or that flag that you have a risk. So it's mainly going through the process. So I've not seen really restructuring of transaction, but really thinking through what is really reportable and do we really need to go here for this particular transaction. But it's really a case-by-case assessment, not really restructuring.
I also would say it's not necessarily restructuring, but it is in the evaluation of a potential buyer, it is a criteria. Because if you look at equity funds and how they're structured and the complexity, it's much more difficult to evaluate than having a simple structured kind of a company that's based in a few national markets idly around Europe. So it does play a role in the evaluation, but at the end, I mean, M&A teams, they look at the purchase price and the conditions. So it will be a factor, but it will not be the only factor that plays a role.
Understood.
It's not about FDI, but we have seen that some years ago when we didn't have the below threshold issue in Italy, to have transactions reduced in scope to have lower turnover thresholds so that turnover thresholds wouldn't be met by the transaction. And I would just like to ask a question to myself. If you were wondering how did we manage the below threshold issue recently, in that case, it went in the opposite sense. The transaction grew up in scope and we were above thresholds, so we didn't need to deal anymore with that.
Maybe a point which has nothing to do with M&A, but which has a lot to do with FSR, is that you also have this new filing requirement in the situation of public tender, and the threshold is 250 million euros of value for the tender. And that creates also an obligation on the contracting authority to, well, collect the filings and then transmit them to the European Commission. And I think there is scope for contracting authorities, public bodies, to maybe structure their bids in a way that they would fall below this 250 million threshold to avoid having to wait, for this notification process. I wouldn't say that necessarily, in front of the Commission, but I think there is, in certain markets at least, there is a chance that this may translate into reshaping public tenders.
Well, with that, thank you, everyone. I think we'll close our panel here. I hope you found it interesting. If you have any further questions, I'm sure you can find either of us later today or in the coming days. Thank you very much for joining, and thank you very much for my panelists for today as well. Thank you.